I don't know about you, but I've never come across a nice, truly comprehensive summary of what the Quran says about Jesus Christ, or what Muslims know as Nabi Isa. So, what I've done is I've actually done that. I've looked at the occurrence of Jesus throughout the Quran and related verses. So, not just the verses that mention Jesus, but also contextual verses around that. And what I've done is I've done a tabulation of all those verses. They come to about 100 verses. And I've then done a bit of a textual analysis on those verses. What I did was to look at each verse, at each occurrence, and extract some of the key points from that verse. And that led me to a bigger picture of what the Quran really speaks about Jesus Christ. And I'd like to present that to you now. First of all, let me start by sharing with you what the Quran does not include about Jesus Christ, because that is actually also quite interesting and surprising. If we look at the verses that I've tabulated, and after looking at all 100 cases of Jesus' appearance in the Quran, what I found was that the following very, very core and essential important points made about Jesus in the Bible are really not present in the Quran. And let me show you what those are. First of all, I don't see Joseph, the husband of Mary, anyway. I don't see mention of Pontius Pilate, the Romans, and the court case in the tribunal, whatever that Jesus faced with Pontius Pilate. I don't see details of the crucifixion or the crucifixion. I don't see the nativity story, the manger, the baby born in a stable, the star, the three wise men from the east. I don't see those. I don't see any details about the burial of Jesus, the tomb. I don't see anything in the Quran about the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, details about him on the third day being discovered as being, no longer in the tomb, and also the appearances, what Christians call the post-mortem appearances after his supposed death. That is not in the Quran. There's no mention of the famous Paul, the apostle Paul, also known as Saul of Tarsus. No mention whatsoever. The sermons of Jesus are also left out. Details of the disciples, their names are left out. The Quran refers to a group of supporters, which the Quran doesn't call disciples. The Quran refers to them as the Hawariyun, and I'd like to go into that a bit more later. Then there's also no mention in the Quran of the King Herod, of the Pharisees, of Jerusalem, Bethlehem. No details of the miracles. Yes, 4 miracles are mentioned: the healing of the blind and the leper, the resuscitation of the dead, the creation, the fashioning of the bird, and the giving life to that bird with the grace of God. That is there. Judas's betrayal and death, not in the Quran, as well as Mary Magdalene. So that is a number of, I think, all the core aspects that Christians would normally regard as the core aspects of Jesus Christ are not in the Quran. It's absent. Now, I'm not saying they might not be appearing in the Hadith books, because Hadith books are obviously influenced by Christian and Jewish scholarship. Hadith books are, as we've discussed on this channel, often the product of ex-Christians or ex-Jews who entered Islam and brought their stories with them, or who remained crypto-Jews and crypto-Christians and intentionally smuggled those stories into Islam. So the whole idea, even the Gospel of Barnabas, some Muslims believe in the Gospel of Barnabas. The Gospel of Barnabas is not a recognized Islamic text. It is suspected of being a latter-day invention or fabricated work. So a lot of Muslims actually have a lot of faith in the so-called Gospel of Barnabas, which is dated back not more to the Ottoman Empire, to the times of the Ottoman Empire. So that is just a list of the important issues in Christianity that you will not find in the Qur'an. So what is the Qur'an? How do we then view, as before I go into what the Qur'an does say, as a summary for you? What we must understand is that the Quran is not a complete historical text. The Quran is not a comprehensive chronology or annal of it doesn't actually give you the detailed historical stories and developments. What the Quran does do is, and it calls itself a confirmer or a authenticator, or a book that will sit as an authentication over other books. So whatever we can find about history, whether it is from secular sources, whether it is from the New Testament or the Old Testament, the Quran presents itself as an authenticator, tool of authentication, as a criterion or as a furqan over any of those books. And so that is why when we look at the Quran, we are applying corrective points over an existing body of literature. So in no way are we required to negate or eliminate that literature, whether it's the Bible, whether it's secular research works like Josephus or Philo, old Roman works. But the Quran will offer a corrective kind of corrections or editing, or a review of those previous works. So that is pretty much the approach that I've taken, is that I am not averse to the Bible and to other secular works of history. After all, we need to use whatever people have done, whatever efforts have been invested in the effort of understanding history. All efforts, no matter religious or philosophical background, we need to learn from all people and all sincere or genuine efforts at uncovering or understanding history, and that is pretty much my attitude. And so we're not going to be ending up with a blank or skeletal understanding. I intend to use this investigation, which we will start off with the Quran, but I intend to use this investigation to come to a good, clear, holistic picture of who the historical Jesus Christ is, if you're an adherent of the Quran, and to understand his mission more clearer. So let's start. So the point of where my research started was in fact to uncover the verses. So those verses were all mined or sought in the Quran using whatever means, technology and other means. And they do come to about 100 verses, give and take 1 or 2 or 3. And what I then did was I took each verse and extracted from that verse the few points, the few factual points that could be taken out from that verse. And after doing that for the 100 verses, what I came up with was actually a set of points that were very cohesive, and I grouped those points, and they actually constituted a number of themes, no more than I think about 4 or 5 themes. And those are the themes that I'd like to share with you then during this video. And these are the themes that show up when you try and investigate the historical Jesus from the Quran. The key themes, the key factual points. Now, let me first get the first two initial points out of the way. John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, is mentioned in the Quran by the name of Yahya, the son of Zechariah. He is regarded as a very highly blessed man from birth to death, and he is regarded as a very learned man. Now, I'm not going to, the Quran does not really, in my reading, tell me if I'm wrong. If you've read the Quran, tell me where I'm wrong. But in the Quran, it never really links John the Baptist with Jesus. All it does is they are grouped together in Surah Ali Imran. So there we see at the same time that Mary lived, the Quran uses that kind of terminology that pretty much at the time when Mary was born, then at that same more or less time in history, Zechariah prayed to God for a son and was blessed with a very pious son called John the Baptist, or what we call in Arabic Yahya. And we know that Yahya, Zechariah and Mary interacted. And so it is just obvious that these two, Mary and John the Baptist, that they were contemporaries in time. And so John the Baptist being a prophet of God, Jesus also being another prophet of God in our understanding, it means that they lived more or less as contemporaries. Now, the Bible does fill in the detail in this case. The Bible or historical texts do mention John the Baptist as the one that really introduced Jesus, that really, they use the term baptized him, and then announced him to the world as the Messiah. So he was almost like a precursor to Jesus. He himself was a martyr, but not before he could introduce and, bless or point to the people, the person of Jesus Christ. So that is John the Baptist. Then what does the Quran say about Mary? Because that is actually, I do believe that the Quran actually says more about Mary, what the Quran refers to as Maryam alayhi salam. Now, Mary is, quite a few things are mentioned about Mary. For example, I list here, and I'll tell you now what is not mentioned. Mary learns via an angel of her future pregnancy and protests because she, at that stage, when the angel informs her that you are to give birth to a great person, a word will come from God via you. The word will come from God and will be conduited via you, via yourself as a son that will be born from you. She objects because she's not been intimate with a man until that point, and she's assured that God is able to accomplish whatever, And so she bears the baby and she suffers stigma from her community. They stigmatize her because she's not seen as having been, with a man. And she then, after the stigma, the baby actually absolves her from the stigma. So the baby speaks from the cradle and absolves Mary, and at that point then also achieves some sort of fame, or because of the ability of the child to speak, or the baby to speak. Mary has a baby in isolation, away from people. Mary is not pregnant when given the revelation. Mary is not worthy of the slander of the Jews, is what the Quran says, and Mary is related to Aaron. Now that is a point of criticism, because Mary is addressed as a sister of Aaron in the Quran. But we must understand that the Quran refers to the family of Mary as the Ali Imran. Ali Imran. Mary is a member of Ali Imran. Now, Ali Imran, in a way, can is similar to Bani Imran, Bani Israel, Ali Imran. It means the clan of Imran, the sons and daughters of Imran. And when the Quran refers to Mary as a sister of Aaron, it simply means one of the children of Imran. So if we are all children of Imran, it means we are sisters and brothers at that level. So the Quran doesn't, and it is not even the Quran. The Quran cites somebody that addresses Mary and says, "Oh, you've done a terrible thing, you sister of Aaron." In other words, you sister of the great Aaron, the great prophet Aaron. You have committed such a breach when they see Mary pregnant. But when they say, "You sister of Aaron," it's not to say that you're a sister of Aaron. The Quran is not silly to associate Mary with Aaron. Clearly there's a time gap between the two. And I'll tell you now why there's a time gap. A huge time gap of more than 1,000 years between Aaron and Mary. But it is that the tribe of Imran, that particular group of, I guess, one of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel, they regard their members as brothers and sisters. And so that is why Mary is related to Aaron by being a member of the same tribe, the Ali Imran tribe. Right, so that is pretty much what the Quran speaks about Mary. There is a part in Surah Ali Imran that I might have left out that she is but the focus here is more or less on Jesus. So let me quickly move on. I come then to Isa's or Jesus's distinguishing features. Now the Quran makes to any Christian viewer of this presentation, or this video, let me mention that my reading of the Quran, and I've got distinguishing features here, which is very, very important. My reading of the Quran is that the Quran, in fact, places Jesus in a very special category. Jesus is not treated, although Jesus, as I will as you will see later, Jesus is definitely not an object of worship or a partner in the Godhead, partner with God. Jesus definitely enjoys a very, very, very special status, which I even think is special even as a prophet, special even as a messenger. And you can see now when I show you these clear points in the Quran. Number one, Isa is a spirit that proceeds from God. That is how Jesus is described, right? As a spirit that proceeds from God. Isa, or Jesus, is strengthened by the Holy Spirit, Ruh al-Qudus. Now, what is the Holy Spirit? Now, I have made a video on this, and my conclusion after investigating the word Ruh in the Quran is that Ruh al-Qudus is definitely one of the titles or the terms that is used for the Archangel Gabriel, right? What Muslims or Arabs call Jibril, or the main instrument of God's agency. You see, God uses angels as instruments to give effect to his agency in the physical world. And Jibril is the key instrument. Jibril is sort of like the primary instrument of God's world, Jibril. But Jibril is not God. Jibril, or the Ruh al-Quds, is a creation of God. It is a servant. It is a tool, an instrument of God. But then it states very clearly in these verses that I've surveyed that Jesus is strengthened by that Ruh al-Quds, Qudus, the Holy Spirit. And so Jesus, I don't see any other prophet being given that accolade of being strengthened by the Holy Spirit. So that is really unique and special that I can see. Then Isa and Mary have a unique and special status that comes out from these verses. Then also Isa, Jesus, is regarded as in a way similar to the prophet or the first prototypical man, Adam, fashioned by a special decree from God. God said, be, and they were. So they are sort of like exceptional to the normal man and woman in the sense that they have received a special intervention from God in their coming about. Right? So Jesus, very special in that sense, also in his organic or biological or physiological origination, it is different from the regular human being. Jesus is blessed, Isa is blessed from birth to death and in the afterlife. Now, whereas some prophets might have been envoyed at a very old age, at an older age maybe, appointed when they were, like the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, he was only appointed at the age of, when he was in his 40s, was he envoyed and appointed as a messenger of God. And Muslims don't regard the years before he was 45, I think, as years of prophethood. The prophet really starts in his middle age, at his advanced age. Whereas Jesus is a prophet like literally from birth to death. That's also a special distinguishing feature of Jesus. The same with Yahya, of course, I've mentioned to you. Then Jesus has the special title as the designated one. Now, if you've watched the Matrix, the movie series, the first Matrix movie, then you will see that the key character in the movie is a chap called Neo. And he is regarded as the one. You see, they don't use the chosen one, but the term the one is used. And I want you to understand the way that Jesus is listed as the Christos or the Al-Masih. Masih, Christos, Perikletos, all these words mean the anointed one, the chosen one, the designated one. And the Qur'an very, very much endorses that position for Jesus as the designated one, the one, which is also a very special distinguishing feature for Jesus Christ in the Qur'an. Then further on, the Qur'an states that Jesus is highly regarded on earth. He will receive huge acclaim sort of planet-wide, and that is a fact. Like at the time when the Qur'an was revealed, Christianity had merely spread. The extent of Christianity was merely sort of the Mediterranean and maybe connected countries, and Europe and Britain had not even been Christian as far as I'm aware of. I think Britain and Europe, I'm not too sure when they became Christian, but I think with Charlemagne maybe, and when we talk Charlemagne, we're talking 800s, Common Era. So by 600 Common Era, Christianity had not spread that fast, but the Qur'an in fact foresees that Christianity will become, or Jesus Christ will become, a globally celebrated figure. Then Isa, or Jesus, embodies God's very spoken word since infancy, which uses Mary as a conduit for. Now that's a it's a tough one initially for me to understand. What does the Quran mean by Isa being kalima, a word proceeding from God? What does it mean? And all I can understand through that is that the very word that Jesus spoke, the very message that he presented, that he imparted, that he shared with people, were inspired by God Almighty since from birth to death. Whatever he uttered, whatever he said, was completely aligned and approved by God. He, in fact, he represents a communication, a divine communique. Every word spoken by Jesus is representative, can be embodied, is a personification of a divine communique. And that is what I see the Quran is in fact saying. Then Isa is a well-provisioned servant of God. That comes out very clearly. He is strengthened by the Holy Spirit. He is in many ways very special. The powers that he has of healing, of resuscitating, these are all powers that are made him a very well-provisioned servant of God. And I use the word servant because the Quran will come to that point. And then the Quran also mentions in one verse that angel men could be made the norm, but it is not. And that one verse, let me get that verse to you. Take a look at this verse here, chapter 43, verse 59, and you'll see what I mean. Now this verse builds up from 43:58, and they say, "Are our gods best or he? This they set forth to thee, only by way of disputation here. They are a contentious people." Speaking about Jesus here, the pagans in the company of the Prophet Muhammad, diminishes Jesus to some extent and argues that our gods, our pagan gods, are actually better than Jesus. And in huwa illa abdun an'amna alayhi. He was no more than a servant. We granted our favor to him, and we made him an example to the children of Israel. And then comes the verse. وَلَوْ نَشَاءُ لَجَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ مَلَائِكَةً فِي الْأَرْضِ يَخْلُفُونَ. And if it were our will, we could make angels from among you, succeeding each other on the earth. And then finally 61, and Jesus shall be a sign for the coming of the hour of judgment. Therefore, have no doubt about the hour, but follow you me. This is a straight way. So what the important point that I'm drawing here from 43:60 is that angel men, men who are really angels, who are really empowered with massive resources, massive powers on earth, could be made the norm, but has not been made the norm. If it were our will, we could make angels from among you, succeeding each other on the earth. So God could have made it the norm to produce these angel men, right, who could just come and be extremely powerful and just, carry out the will of God without flinching, or without struggling, without battling. But that angel men concept was not made the norm. Now the question I have is, was Isa such an angel man? That is the question I have. Was he such an angel man? And it's all under this discussion of Isa or Jesus' distinguishing features. And the reason I'm having this discussion with you, and especially if you're a Christian viewer, is that the Quran really does offer Jesus a greater than ordinary station. And you need to understand, if you look at these distinguishing features, that Jesus is very, very, very elevated. Unlike the non-Christians of the time who regarded him in a despicable way, as a magician, as a con man. That is how the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud views Jesus. Now, if you say that the Qur'an was just, a branch of Judaism, or the Qur'an was inspired by Jewish scholars and Jewish doctors, then you need to really sit up and tell me, do these great elevated features applied or attached to Jesus Christ, are these evidence of a Prophet Muhammad that was in the pocket of Talmudic Jews? Never. I mean, the Quran would never speak in this way about Jesus if it was a project of Talmudic Judaism of the 6th century. And so this really proves that the Quran, that Islam is taking a completely independent position as far as Jesus is concerned, offering Jesus and his mother an extremely, extremely distinguished position. What does the Quran say about the mission of Jesus? Right, this is what it says. It says Isa came to re-authenticate the Torah. So the word musaddiqan lit-Torah, that word comes up, and I've already spoken to you about the word musaddiqan. Musaddiqan has to be read not as confirming, but as authenticating, which means it confirms where necessary and it corrects where necessary. So musaddiqan means to authenticate what came before him, and not wrongly to confirm. I mean, if that was the case, then it means Jesus would allow all that was being practiced wrongfully. So Isa came with clarification, bayinat. Bayinat means to offer clarification on matters that had become convoluted, that had become overcomplicated. Bayinat means basically to simplify, to set it out logically, to re-explain it. Isa came with proof and evidence. Isa, Jesus himself, represents in himself evidence of the final hour. Jesus came with a gospel. Now the word gospel in the Quran is, the word that is used is Injil, goes back to the word evangelios, a Greek word which means good news. And my understanding of why would Isa come with good news, it just means Isa's good news is a relaxing of the stringent, tight laws that the reigning Pharisees, the reigning priestly class at the time was imposing. So basically coming with a relaxation of the strictness with which the existing priestly class was implementing the old law. Then Isa came to re-authenticate the law, so that is part of it, also in the verses that I've read. Isa declared lawful that which was wrongfully made unlawful. Isa is a message carrier from God. Revelation given to Isa. The gospel offers criteria to govern by. Isa came to announce. Then also importantly, one of the verses state very clearly that Jesus made the announcement of a more famous prophet to arrive in due course. And if we look at the word that Jesus uses, he says, I came also to announce the coming of Ahmad. Ahmad. Now, Ahmad means more famous, more celebrated. And so the word Muhammad means famous. That is, if you didn't know that, then I'm here to tell you it means celebrated, highly regarded, famous in our modern terms. And so the word Ahmad, he means, when he says that I announced to you the coming of Ahmad, what he means is that a more famous prophet is to come after my time. Right. So that is some of the missions, and I'm summarizing to you, remember, the Qur'an's position on Isa. Then the powers of Isa. He was given miraculous signs. That's clearly stipulated. The miracles that are mentioned are the healing of the blind and the lepers. He could fashion the likeness of a bird and it would become a bird. He could resuscitate the dead, inform people of what they eat and store at home. That's just an interesting verse that mentions that he could tell people what was in their grocery cupboards and what they were eating before without having seen it. He also, obviously, the miracle that I mentioned earlier, absolves Mary as a baby when he can actually articulate and speak in the cradle. Now, I always thought this was a very difficult idea or thought to ascribe intelligent communication to a baby, but not after I saw this. I would have found that an extremely difficult thing to understand if it wasn't for a recent modern day miracle of this Professor Soborno, who at the age of, what is he, a year old, at the age of a year, where he actually is able to read the entire Greek alphabet, let alone the Western alphabet. He's actually able to read the Greek alphabet.
Go.
Excellent. So 18?
Sigma.
9.
Tau. Uphill.
2.
Uphill.
Excellent.
And so why I'm mentioning this to you is that the idea that Isa being given the miracle to speak in the cradle and to absolve his mom as a baby is not as far-fetched as you might think. We are having latter-day or present-day sort of contemporary miracles and by a miracle I mean a very unlikely and almost impossible event taking place. But not impossible, an almost impossible event taking place. So those are the powers, and then I'm going to come then to the exaggerations. Let me deal with the exaggerations first. The Quran is very, very replete with verses that caution the Christians against exaggerating the station of Jesus. So I'll run through them. The Quran states that Christians do exaggerate Jesus' station. Christians should not exaggerate in their beliefs. Not Jesus nor Mary are to be worshipped. Jesus is not partnered in the Godhead. Jesus was no more than a well-provisioned servant of God. God is not a Trinity, that is very clear. Jesus is not averse to worshipping God. God does not father children as in procreating. Israelites were verbally condemned by both David and Jesus on account of the exaggerations, and Mary and Jesus never called for worship of themselves. And that is pretty much confirmed by the New Testament. If you read the New Testament, what you will find is that it is very, very, very hard to find any word to the effect of Jesus announcing himself as God. Now, there are Christians who point to certain indirect indications where Jesus is describing himself as God, where he describes himself as he, before everything I am, and the I am is used as a description of what Jesus is, what God is. But really, there's no direct, clear, and it would be almost on every second page, isn't it? If that is the most important precept within Christianity that God is in human form, Jesus, it would be on every page, I would assume. Just as the nature of God is on every page in the Qur'an. If Jesus' nature was godly, was part of God, it should be on every page. You shouldn't go and find, and only in the book of John do you really find these verses that could be interpreted as Jesus saying, I'm God. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's absent. You don't find any words to the effect where Jesus is describing himself as God. And so the Qur'an is really borne out by that fact that they never call, Jesus especially never ever calls anyone to worship him. And so those are the exaggerations, which are also very common. And then finally, I'm going to come to the story of Jesus, to some of the developments, the historical developments, and there are numerous. Let's quickly run through them. Isa comes after Moses. That's a fact that comes from the Quran very clearly. If you apply your mind to the Quran, you're also able to find exactly when Jesus came. Jesus comes in a time when the priests are extremely powerful, and we therefore, by looking at the context and by, the position of the powerful priestly class, the rabbis, we place Jesus basically after about 530 BC, and that priestly class really ruled until Rome invaded Palestine, the Holy Land, in around 150. So there's a sort of golden, there's a window of period between minus 500, in other words 500 BC, and the time of the beginning of the new millennium. So that is in that period where Jesus comes according to the Quran. Jesus is sent to the Israelites. That's very clear from the verses. Amidst the custodianship of the law by the rabbis and the abuse of their position arose Isa. That is very clear, is that the doctors, the sages, the religious elite really necessitates the arising of Jesus Christ. He addresses the Israelites. The Israelites viewed Jesus as a practitioner of black magic. That comes out in the Quran. So it aligns with the Talmudic views of what the Talmud calls Jesus, the son of Pandera. So there's a Jesus character in the Talmud, Yeshua, and the accusations of black magic really aligns to the Talmudic passages here. Isa was dismissed as a sorcerer by the Jews. That is also aligns with the Talmudic passages that describe Jesus in the Talmud as a practitioner of black magic. Rejected by his people, the Israelites, right, through their religious establishment, the priestly class. The scheming against Jesus was relentless. That comes out in the Quran. Then, in the Quran, very clearly, one sees that Jesus then seeks help from other quarters. He seeks sort of refuge somewhere else after being persecuted in his own immediate surroundings. He sought help from the onslaught of the Jewish elite, the religious elite. And then the Hawariyun answered his call. Now the Hawariyun, Muslim translators have simply just went and did a one-to-one translation as though Hawariyun are the disciples. But a disciple is a Sahabi, and the word Sahabis are not used in the Quran. Hawariyun is a different word. What does Hawariyun mean? Let's see. And to understand the word Hawari, I want us to look at this extract from Lane's dictionary, which depends on very, very ancient Arabic dictionaries to bring the meaning into English. Now, Hawari one who whitens clothes or garments by washing and beating them. Hence, its plural, Hawariyun, applied to the companions, the apostles of Jesus, because their trade was to do this or to apply it. One who is freed from every, right? So, the Hawariyun is a particular way in which people dressed. And what I want to offer you here is a development on the simplistic understanding of the Hawariyun. The Hawariyun was not a few people. The Quran doesn't mention 12 disciples. The Quran mentions that Jesus sought refuge, and he found refuge by the Hawariyun, by the people dressed in white. Right? By the people dressed in white. The Hawariyun are a devout group in the Quran. The Hawariyun are qissisin, and from there I come to the conclusion, and you are welcome to interrogate this position that I'm going to propose here, and that I find very, very strong evidence for, is that the Hawariyun, in fact, are what is commonly nowadays understood to be the Essenes. The Essenes is a certain type or a certain ideological or tribal class of people within the Holy Land that dates back a few hundred years before, or 150 years before before the new millennium, before the common era, right? Before the year one, in other words. And some of the features of the Essenes, in fact, is that they used to dress in white clothes. And I can show that to you. Take a look at this excerpt, which I'm taking from the Jewish Encyclopedia. There you can see jewishencyclopedia.com. And it's an entry that explains the Essenes as a particular group of men who lived at the time of Jesus, and before his time, in fact. And it says very clearly that they were the sort of a unblemished type of people, morally very pure. They do not use oil, probably from fear that oil was not kept perfect. They always dress in white garments. They always dress in white garments. And so the Quran's position that I showed you a moment ago, that that shows the Essenes, that shows the Hawariyun to be dressed in white. And that is really what we are talking about here, is that Jesus was given refuge by the men in white. And I'm going to put my neck out and say that is an explanation and a new understanding that I don't think you've heard anywhere else before, is that the Hawari, not from any other Quranic student, the Hawariyun are in fact the people, the men dressed in white, where Jesus received refuge. Now the Quran also refers to them as qissisin. And isn't it amazing how close the word qissisin comes to the word Essenes? And I don't know what is the origin of the word Essenes. In fact, that in the Jewish Encyclopedia, you might want to read up and see whether the word qissisin, because qissisin means a ardent consumer of literature. And that is exactly what the Essenes were. They were very ardent consumers and producers of literature. Qissisin, qasas. You know, these are all related words. And the qissisin, the Quran refers, the word qissisin in the Quran refers to men of scholarship, of deep knowledge and scholarship. And so what the Qur'an is making very clear, and the Qur'an does go into it quite a bit. The Qur'an doesn't do it in a superficial way. The Hawariyun, the men in white, what we simply translate as the disciples, is not just 12 disciples, it's actually a community. And we now know that the community of Essenes were occupying vast pieces of land on the side of the Dead Sea, where we actually have the massive discovery, the ground earth-shattering discovery of 1948 of almost 1,000 ancient scrolls or fragments of ancient books and literature, including the Old Testament, including other literature, discovered in the land of the Essenes. And so Jesus in the Quran is very clearly found to have been shielded by these Hawariyun, which I regard as the Essenes. And I'm not the only one saying that. There are Western scholars that now come to the same conclusion, that Jesus, after escaping the wrath or the persecution of the Jewish priests and the rabbis, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and whatever, found refuge with another Jewish sect, which was called the Essenes. Maybe not in the same way as the Pharisees, but also the Essenes also being regarded as a Jewish sect. And then going on, God saved Isa from the Israelites' persecution that comes out in the Quran. The Hawariyun, the Qissisin, as the Quran says, they become the helpers. They come to Isa's support. Right? Very similar to how the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ finds refuge in Medina and has the people of Medina becoming his support, his Ansar. So Jesus Christ similarly gets Ansar or helpers from the Qissisin, from the Essenes, or from the Hawariyun, from a tribe, from a people, from a town, from a sect. They become the Ansarullah. The Hawariyun engaged with Isa on their own to be assured of his authenticity, and there's a verse in the Quran where the Hawariyun engages with him and they request food, a miraculous table with food, and God comforts the Hawariyun or the Qissisin or the Essenes, comforts them with proof, with a proviso that they had to remain committed, and so they undergo a new promise with God, right, to give the necessary support to Jesus. So the Israelites became split between pro and anti-Jesus factions. That is what the Quran stipulates very clearly, is that the Israelites became split between those who hated Jesus and those who loved him. The Qissisin or the Hawariyun, or what I see as the Essenes, they embrace Jesus. They give him support and shelter, and they shield him from the attack of the other priestly classes, which were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And Isa's position gave rise, it is actually the point where Judaism splits into two sides: the Judaic side, the Talmudic or the traditional ancient Jewish class under the Sadducees and the Pharisees, which later became defunct, and the Essenes. So what the Quran then is saying is that these Hawariyun, they are the future Christians, in fact. So Isa was not murdered by the Jews. That is clearly stipulated in the Quran. Was not murdered or crucified by the Jews. He found refuge. He was taken by God himself. Amid their subversion and their plotting, Isa was taken away by God. Sects emerged after Isa, the pro-Isa sect amongst the Jews, they eventually prevailed. The Qur'an does mention that very carefully. The pro-Jesus section became more powerful. Jesus' followers become eternally powerful, in fact, in his wake. His followers are people with compassion. That is, the Quran describes those Essenes and the Nazarenes, which they eventually then became. Their asceticism exceeded what God required. They did over-deliver in terms of being ascetic. Those who claim Nazarene helper status are more gentle and kind to God's people. That comes out clearly. The subsequent disputes are part of a divine plan that is stipulated. People of the book must recognize Isa. He will testify against his detractors. And those are a summary of the points that come out in terms of who Jesus is in the Holy Quran. And isn't it remarkable how amazing, how smooth the story fits in partially with the Christians' understanding of Jesus as well as the Jewish position on Jesus. As I said, there are certain areas of agreement with the Talmud. The Talmud, in fact, does view Jesus as a con man, as a trickster, as a practitioner of magic. And the Quran confirms that that is them. The Quran does not see Jesus' confrontation as essentially against Rome. It sees Jesus' confrontation as essentially against the priestly class of Israel. And that is really where the battle lies. Jesus is somebody that comes and extricates the Jews from the complicated imposition of the law, from the overcomplicated law which the priests have turned the book of God into. And so that is, my friend, just a summary of how the Quran sees Jesus, what is mentioned, what is not mentioned, and what I will do next time. In fact, there's one more slide here, and that is a slide that there's a few verses that actually sets out what the Prophet Muhammad's contemporaries thought of Jesus. And Muhammad's contemporary pagans saw Jesus as a lesser god than their deities. So obviously the idea of Jesus being a deity is already in existence at the time of the Prophet. The Christians he meets are already regarding Jesus as a deity. People around Muhammad were skeptical of Isa when Muhammad held him in high esteem. There's also another verse where they actually frown upon Jesus when he comes up with Jesus. And this is very understandable that when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ traveled from Mecca, in his hijrah from Mecca to Medina, he then encountered the Jews of Medina, which he had previously not really encountered. In fact, they gave him support initially. But when he started giving positive views of Jesus Christ, they were very, very skeptical, and that is a fact. So he had to deal with the skepticism of the Jews because they regarded Jesus as a con man, as a soothsayer, as a magician, as in the Talmud, which was already around when the Prophet came. The Talmud was one of the books, the Babylonian Talmud was around. He then had to deal with their prejudices against Jesus, which he clearly, as we can see, the Quran clearly vindicates Jesus, it vindicates his mother, but it stops short of saying Jesus is a God. Jesus can never be a God. He's not worthy of worship. He himself is a worshiper of God. But as I mentioned, as I showed you earlier, there is a hint that Jesus is also not really human. Jesus is more than just a mere mortal. But not in terms of being worthy of worship, but in the sense of being a form of life, a creation that is different, not superior to ordinary men, but who actually could exercise powers on this earth that were beyond what a regular ordinary man could do. So that is a summary of the verses, the 100 or so verses. I hope you found it useful. In the next video, if I still have another chance, I'd like to construct or reconstruct for you the story of Jesus as I understand it.